Fitness content can be confusing when you hear a bunch of words and concepts that are never defined. Volume, frequency, RAR, RPE, what do they mean? This video is going to define a lot of common fitness words and concepts. To understand fitness content, we first must understand the basis of all: volume, frequency, and intensity. Volume can be defined simply as the amount of sets and reps done in a specific time frame. Either it could be volume per day or volume per week. Example, my volume for my shoulders is 8 sets per day. I train them 3 times per week, which will give me 24 weekly sets. Frequency is the amount of days you train per week. Example, I train 4 times per week. Intensity has 2 definitions in the sense that different people might use this word differently. The most accepted meaning of intensity is simply the amount of load of the exercise. Basically, if it is heavy for you, it is intense. Example, my intensity is really high. I use 225 pounds, which is really heavy for me. This type of intensity can be calculated because it is simply the load you are using. This definition is used greatly in strength training because strength programs recommend not reaching failure all the time, and they also have specific reps per set that must be done. Another definition of intensity is how close you are to reaching failure. Failure is the point where you cannot complete another rep. Example, my workouts are always high intensity. I always fail or try to go beyond it. This definition is more subjective because calculating this is not reliable at all. If you can do one more rep or not, the only way to know this is if you try it yourself. Therefore, your performance can be affected by self-imposed limits. One problem of defining intensity as simply the amount of load you are doing is that you can struggle and have an intense workout while using moderate or even light loads. Failure can be reached through different loads. Intensity can either mean effort or load, and therefore it is important to make the distinction. When using these 3 words, people add high or low to the mix, like high volume or low frequency or high intensity. But before understanding what high volume is, we first must understand something about ourselves. We are different. Not everybody's limits are the same, and this also applies to performance. Our physical state and our background matters. Not everybody can lift the same weight. You can expect a gym beginner to lift 225 pounds in the bench press on his first day. These differences in our bodies not only apply to the load itself, but also in the amount of sets and reps we can do, volume, and the amount of days we can work out per week, frequency. Therefore, in the same way, 225 pounds might not be a high load for somebody that can do 315 pounds. High volume for a beginner might not be really high for somebody else. Intensity, frequency, and volume are not only affected by individual differences, but also by themselves. For example, doing 5 sets with a maximum load and a maximum intensity might be considered to be high volume or excessive volume for most people. But 8 sets with a moderate load and high intensity might be considered to be okay volume for most people. Intensity will affect volume and frequency. Frequency affects both volume and intensity, and volume affects both frequency and intensity. All these 3 affect recovery, and recovery affects these 3. You cannot do high volume, high intensity, and high frequency at the same time because your body needs rest and energy is not infinite. Therefore, each change in your workout has a trade-off. Context matters a lot when talking about high volume or high anything else. High volume can mean a lot of sets and reps per day or weekly. For example, if somebody does a lot of sets and reps and he does it per day, but the load he uses is a moderate one, and he only trains 2 to 3 times per week, the volume per week might not be as much as somebody who trains 6 days per week with moderate volume per session. When talking about volume, frequency, and intensity, we must take into account individual differences, the effect or trade-offs that they have on themselves, and more context. Volume, frequency, and intensity might be the basis of all training. It really doesn't matter what training you do. You will hear about these words. Another popular word in fitness that might be confusing is the word optimal. Optimal to a lot of people simply means the best course of action, or the best thing to do. However, what a lot of people don't understand is that the best course of action might be influenced by individual differences, or even what we simply like to do. In bodybuilding, there have been huge training differences between the most popular bodybuilders. I think the most popular example is the high volume of Arnold against the extreme intensity of Mike Menzer. Even in strength training, there are differences in how some athletes decide to approach their intensity, their recovery, and their volume. Individual differences change intensity, volume, and frequency. Therefore, it makes what is optimal slightly different to each one of us. Or even you might have time constraints or consistency issues, and what appears to be the optimal training might be highly inconvenient for your life. What is optimal has basically become a buzzword for people to create authority without actually providing arguments or personal results. Optimal training is probably a spectrum, not an extreme. But because most people like to believe that their training is the best or optimal, it has become an extreme that you either are in or out. Now that we have talked about the basics, let's go through the rest of the concepts much faster. Progressive overload is an important concept to understand because without a challenge, there is no adaptation to face and nothing to overcome. A progressive overload simply means the process of increasing the load over time to create a challenge. However, some people also use this word for the increase of reps or sets in an exercise. This is because increasing reps and sets is also a way to increase the challenge. And most often than not, progressive overload involves both the increase of reps and sets and the load. An example of progressive overload will be to add 10 pounds in an exercise each 2 months, or increase your limit of 6 reps to 12 reps. Progressive overload in calisthenics can be a bit more complicated, and that is why there are specific terms. Progression and regression are basically a calisthenic term. Because of the lack of external weight, in order to increase the load of an exercise or the torque demand, you can move your body in different ways or positions. Whether it be a load arm increase like the front lever, or decreasing support points such as unilateral variations, or using less muscles. Progressions are harder variations, while regressions are easier variations. An example of a progression will be to increase the declination of a push-up to give more tension to the hands. A regression will be to increase the declination to give more tension to the feet instead of the hands in a push-up. Failure is a common word in fitness, and when talking about failure, there are a few acronyms that might confuse a lot of people. RAR means reps in reserve. RPE means rate of perceived exertion. Both are a way to measure how close you are to failure, basically how intense or the amount of effort in your training. There are discussions about which is a better way to measure failure, but just know that if you ever hear these acronyms, they are about measuring failure. Another basic word is range of motion. Range of motion is how much you are actually moving during a single rep. The acronym for range of motion is ROM or ROM. A few confusing words that you will always hear are prime movers, antagonistic muscles, concentric, and eccentric. These 6 words are very similar between each other and they have to do with range of motion. Prime movers are the muscles that create the motion first, whereas the antagonistic movers or muscles are the muscles that oppose the prime movers. In the elbow, the bicep will be the prime mover, whereas the antagonistic muscle will be the tricep. That is because the rested position of the elbow is really close to the maximal extension position that your elbow can create. When the elbow is resting, it is mostly extended and it can't go anywhere else other than the direction the bicep is pulling. Flexion simply means to bend or shorten, and extension means to extend or lengthen. There can be flexion and extension of the joints and also of the muscles, so it really depends on what you are talking about. If you ever hear these words, you must understand that the flexion of one muscle can mean the extension of the other muscle. What matters is what muscle is holding the load or tension. For example, when you bend your biceps, you simultaneously extend your triceps. In range of motion, there is a concentric and eccentric. The concentric is when the muscle flexes or bends, whereas the eccentric is when the muscle extends or the length increases. The concentric part can also be called the positive part of the movement, whereas eccentric can be called the negative part of the movement. These next concepts or words are maybe not as used or popular, but they are still good to know about when trying to understand fitness content. When making a list of exercises or a program, you will always hear these 2 words: exercise selection and exercise variation. Exercise selection refers to the cons and positive from choosing one exercise from another. There is a discrimination of exercises because not all exercises are the same. Therefore, there is a benefit in choosing, and choosing something over something else has its positives and negatives. Exercise variation simply means having different exercises or doing different exercises and their benefits or cons. Tension is basically the effect of load on a muscle. Time under tension is the amount of time you expose your muscles to a load. More often than not, a lot of time under tension tends to mean a high amount of sets and reps. Time under tension is affected by the tempo you decide to do the exercise with, the range of motion, and resistance profiles. Mind-muscle connection, as the phrase describes it, is the feeling of actually feeling the tension in the muscle. For muscle building, you will hear these phrases to feel more your muscles instead of your joints. It can also be used to simply describe the feeling of control or body awareness that increases the more you do a certain movement pattern. For example, as you start handstand training, your mind-to-muscle connection in your hands might be crap, but the more you practice, the more you will feel the muscles in your hands and other joints. Bulking and cutting are common words, but what do they mean? Both surplus and deficit are words that you will hear all the time in fitness content. Surplus is an excess of something. Deficit is a lack of something. In order to be a surplus or deficit, there needs to be a maintenance of something. These words are used when talking about the maintenance, surplus, or deficit of your calories. To be consistently in a surplus of calories is to be in a bulking phase. To be consistently in a deficit of calories is to be in a cutting phase. Levers are also something you will hear. A lever is a rigid structure that rotates around a pivot point. Most often, when people talk about levers in fitness, they refer to the effects that their different lengths of their bones or muscle insertions have on their performance. Resistance profiles is also a word that has to do with levers and physics. Resistance profiles is how tension varies during an exercise, or at least that is the intuitive definition. In reality, there is something called torque, which is the rotational force either produced or demanded by levers. The greater the distance of the perpendicular distance of the load or the center of mass compared to the pivot, the harder it is. Resistance profiles are affected by how the load travels in space. An exercise can have a quite straight resistance profile. If the center of mass or load travels in a straight line, the resistance profile is going to be a quite straight resistance profile. Or if the load or center of mass travels in a curved path, it is going to be most likely a bell-shaped resistance profile. Strength curves is also related to levers and resistance profiles. Strength curves is how the different lengths of your muscle, bones, and tendons have an effect on how torque or force is produced in your body. As you move your body, the lengths of muscles and tendons vary. Therefore, according to lever mechanics, your torque or force production varies during the range of motion, and therefore you are stronger or weaker at different ranges of motion. So when people talk about strength curves, they simply refer that they are weaker and stronger at certain ranges of motion. When you understand these concepts and words, fitness content is less overwhelming. Being able to discern fitness content is essential to consume it, and to understand it, you must at least have a grasp of what most of these terms mean. And hopefully you have a grasp of them with this video.